Adrian Valenti grabbed the woman by her wrist before she could turn away 5 minutes before his own wedding was supposed to begin. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just looked at him with eyes so exhausted they had stopped being afraid a long time ago, and she pressed an envelope against his chest. "You walk through that door," Clara Whitmore said, her voice barely above a breath, "and by midnight, you'll be dead." If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of Adrian Valenti's wedding arrived the way all dangerous things did, quietly, dressed in something beautiful. The chapel had been decorated for 3 weeks. White roses from Italy, candles ordered from a family in France that had been making them for 200 years, a string quartet that had performed for heads of state. Every detail had been arranged to communicate one message to everyone who walked through those doors. Adrian Valenti had arrived. He had power. He had permanence. He was untouchable. His mother had cried when she saw the flowers. His closest advisor, a man named Dante who had survived 4 assassination attempts and never once lost his composure, had actually smiled. Even Adrian's reflection in the mirror that morning looked like something from a different life, the kind of life where things went according to plan, where enemies stayed outside the gates, where a man could breathe without calculating the cost. He had spent 11 years building to this moment, 11 years of decisions that kept him awake at night, 11 years of rooms full of men who respected him because they feared him, not because they trusted him, 11 years of choosing empire over everything else. And today was supposed to be the day all of it paid off. His marriage to Victoria Belmont was not a love story, and neither of them had ever pretended otherwise. That was one of the things Adrian respected about Victoria. She was honest about what this was. A merger. A strategic consolidation of power between 2 families who had spent decades orbiting the same dangerous world from opposite sides. The Belmont family had political access Adrian had never been able to buy. Federal relationships, judges, senators who returned calls on Sunday morning. Victoria's father had once sat across a table from a sitting president and emerged with exactly what he wanted. And in exchange, the Belmonts wanted the kind of protection that no election or campaign donation could purchase. They wanted the guarantee that no one would ever move against them in the shadow world, the world where real decisions were made, where real threats lived, where real power was enforced without witnesses. Adrian was that guarantee. The alliance made sense. It made cold mathematical, unemotional sense. And Adrian was a man who had trained himself to live inside cold mathematics. He straightened his tie. He looked at himself one more time. And then Dante knocked. "Car is ready," Dante said through the door. "Guests are seated. Victoria arrived 20 minutes ago. I'll be out in 2 minutes. There's something else." Adrian turned. Dante's voice had a quality he recognized immediately, the careful flatness of a man delivering information he did not want to deliver. Adrian had heard that voice before. It always preceded something that complicated everything. "What is it?" "There's a woman outside the chapel entrance. She's been standing there for about 40 minutes. She won't leave. She says she needs to speak with you before the ceremony." Adrian felt something shift in his chest. Not alarm, exactly. More like a disturbance, the sensation of a pattern breaking. "Who is she?" Dante paused. "Clara Whitmore. She works in your archives division. Has for about 4 years. Adrian thought for a moment and came up almost empty. The name registered vaguely, the way names register when you've signed a document once and never thought about it again. He remembered signing off on a higher recommendation years ago. "Quiet girl," the note said. "Detail-oriented. Excellent record-keeping instincts." He had not thought about her since. "She's an employee," Adrian said. "Have security escort her out." "She said you'd say that." Dante paused again. "She also said to tell you that if you have her removed before you look at what she's carrying, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. However long that turns out to be." The last sentence hit differently than the first. Adrian set down the cufflink he'd been adjusting. "However long that turns out to be." Those were her exact words. He looked at himself one more time in the mirror. Then he turned away from it. "I'll go myself." The moment he stepped outside, he saw her. She was standing about 30 feet from the chapel entrance, pressed close to the side wall as if she was trying to take up as little space as possible. She wore a gray coat that was slightly too large for her. Her hair was pulled back in a way that suggested she hadn't slept. Under the morning light, she looked like someone who had been running for a very long time and had only just stopped. When she saw him coming, she didn't move toward him. She didn't wave. She just watched him approach with an expression he couldn't immediately read, not fear, not relief, not the nervous energy of someone who'd done something reckless. Something quieter than all of those things. Adrian reached her in 10 steps. He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her carefully. She was younger than he expected, mid-30s, maybe. There were dark circles under her eyes that looked days old. Her hands were wrapped around an envelope, the way someone holds something they've been afraid to let go of. "You're Clara Whitmore," he said. "Yes." Her voice was steadier than her hands. "Thank you for coming out." "I almost didn't." He glanced at the envelope. "Dante said you had something to show me." "I do." She held it out. "But I need you to understand something first. You have approximately 90 seconds before I have to be inside that building. Then I'll be brief." Her eyes didn't waver from his. "Everything you think you're walking into today is not what it is. The marriage you're about to enter is not a partnership. It's an acquisition, and you're the asset being acquired." The silence between them lasted exactly 2 seconds. "That's a significant claim," Adrian said. His voice was very quiet. People who knew him well would have recognized that quietness as a warning sign. "For a woman who works in my archives department." "Yes," Clara said. "It is. Do you understand what happens to people who bring me false information with the intention of interfering with my business?" "I do." She didn't blink. "I've worked in your organization for 4 years, Mr. Valenti. I know exactly what you're capable of." She pushed the envelope slightly closer to him. "I also know that what's in here is not false. And I know that if you walk into that hole without reading it, I won't be the one who suffers the consequences." Adrian stared at her for a long moment. Then he took the envelope. He didn't open it immediately. He stood there and studied her first the way he had studied hundreds of people across hundreds of negotiations and encounters. He was looking for the markers of deception, the micro-expressions, the body language of someone performing calm rather than feeling it, the slight tension in the jaw, the too deliberate steadiness of the eyes. Clara Whitmore did not look like a person who was performing anything. She looked exhausted. She looked like a person who had not slept in 3 days and had made a decision that terrified her and had come here anyway. "Why?" he asked. She blinked. "Why what? Why are you here?" The words came out softer than he intended. Not soft in the warm sense, soft in the sense of genuine confusion. "You work in my archives. You earn a salary. You have a life that has nothing to do with my wedding day. Why would you come here? Why would you take this risk?" Clara seemed to consider the question seriously, as if she hadn't expected him to ask it. "Because 3 people in your organization have already died trying to expose what's in that envelope," she said. "And no one noticed. Because they were people like me, quiet people. People no one thought to look at twice." She paused. "I decided that if I was going to be invisible anyway, I might as well use it for something." Adrian opened the envelope. The documents inside were not random. They were not the work of someone who had stumbled onto information accidentally or grabbed whatever they could find. These were organized, methodical. 4 years of careful, patient reconstruction, financial records, correspondence, transaction logs, photographs, internal memos with handwriting he recognized. His own handwriting on some of them. Requests he had made. Decisions he had authorized. All of it woven into a narrative he had never seen from the outside. And then the other documents, the ones that didn't carry his handwriting. Memos between Victoria Belmont's people and someone inside his own organization, someone who had been feeding information outward for at least 2 years. Someone who knew his travel schedules. Someone who knew his security rotations. Someone who had intimate access to the inner workings of his empire and had been selling that access to a competitor who wanted him not just defeated but destroyed. And Victoria's name appeared in those documents, not as a passive recipient of information, as the architect. Adrian's hands were very still. His breathing was very steady. These were things he had trained himself to control in moments when everything inside him wanted to react. "The woman you're about to marry," Clara said quietly, watching him read, "has been planning this for 18 months. The wedding was always the end point. Once you're legally bound to her family, the Belmont legal team has already prepared a series of corporate restructuring documents that will give them controlling interest in 6 of your primary holding companies within 90 days of the marriage. Your own board members have signed preliminary agreements. They believe the restructuring is your idea. Adrian looked up from the documents. My board members. 4 of them. Carlisle, Morano, DeLuca, and Hendricks. He knew all 4 men. He had trusted all 4 men. How did you get this? He asked. I work in your archives, Clara said. People forget that archives means all records, not just the ones people remember they created. I've spent 4 years finding the ones people forgot about. And the names. The specific people. I traced the information leaks backward. She said it simply, without pride. Every time something reached the wrong ears, I looked at what had moved through the system in the previous 48 hours. Eventually the pattern became clear. Adrian looked back at the documents. He turned to a specific page, a communication between someone inside his organization and a man named Ferrara, who was a competitor he had been cautiously managing for 3 years. The date on the communication was 11 days ago. The communication included his travel plans for his honeymoon. Specific hotels, specific dates, specific routes. They were going to wait until the honeymoon, Clara said, before he could ask. Somewhere between Rome and the Amalfi Coast. There are 3 separate contracted parties mentioned in Ferrara's correspondence. The family would have been very sorry. Victoria would have inherited everything. The word inherited landed in the silence like something physical. Adrian closed the envelope. He looked at Clara for a very long moment. You said 3 people died. Trying to expose this, he said. Yes. Who were they? Something moved across her face. Something that wasn't the controlled steadiness she'd been maintaining. A man named Robert Holt in your accounting division. A woman named Sandra Reyes who worked in logistics. And a young man named Paul Destin who was a junior analyst. She paused. They all died within the last 2 years, all of them ruled as accidents. All of them had started asking questions that pointed toward what I eventually found. Adrian was quiet. Did you know them? He asked. I knew Sandra, Clara said. She sat 2 desks down from me for a year before she moved to logistics. She brought homemade bread. On Fridays, she was trying to pay off her student loans. Clara's voice didn't break, but it came close. She was 29 years old. Dante appeared at the chapel door 40 feet away. He looked at Adrian with the expression of a man caught between urgency and deference. Adrian held up one finger. Dante withdrew. What do you want from me? Adrian asked, turning back to Clara. She looked genuinely confused by the question. What? People who bring me information want something in exchange. That's how the world works. So what do you want? Money? Relocation? A different position in the organization? Clara shook her head slowly, and the confusion on her face didn't clear, it deepened. As if the question itself was something she hadn't prepared for. I want you to not die on your honeymoon, she said. I want the people who killed Sandra and Robert and Paul to be held accountable by someone who actually has the power to do something about it. And I want. She stopped. Then she finished quietly. I want to go back to my desk and do my job. Adrian studied her. That's all? That's all. He had been lied to by experts. By people who had spent decades studying the art of deception, who could manufacture sincerity the way other people manufactured paper. He knew what professional dishonesty looked like up close. This was not that. This was a woman who had spent 4 years watching from the corners of a dangerous world, gathering evidence that had gotten 3 of her colleagues killed, and had walked into the most dangerous moment of his life to hand it to him because she had decided someone had to. You came here alone, he asked. Yes. No one knows you're here? I told no one, a beat. If I had told anyone inside the organization, I would have been dead before I reached this building. The implication settled over everything. Go inside, Adrian said. He gestured toward a side door, not the main entrance, not the chapel, not that door, the East Service entrance. Tell the man standing there that I sent you. Stay in the room he puts you in. Don't speak to anyone. Clara hesitated. What are you going to do? Adrian looked back at the chapel entrance. Through the walls, he could almost feel the weight of hundreds of people sitting inside, waiting for him to walk down an aisle toward a woman who had spent 18 months engineering his death. I'm going to end my wedding, he said. What happened next moved the way disasters always do, faster than anyone expected, and with the kind of irreversible momentum that can't be undone once it starts. Adrian walked back into the chapel through the main entrance. The quartet was still playing. The guests were still seated. Flowers still framed the altar, where Victoria stood in a dress that cost more than most people earned in a year. She was beautiful. Adrian had always acknowledged that, in the way you acknowledge any impressive thing, without attachment, without warmth. Victoria Belmont was beautiful, the way a weapon is beautiful, engineered, precise. She smiled when she saw him approaching. The smile was perfect. He had never noticed before how perfect it was. Dante fell into step beside him halfway down the side aisle. "What's happening?" he murmured, low enough that only Adrian could hear. "Clear the exits," Adrian said, just as quietly. "Carlyle, Morano, DeLuca, and Hendricks are not to leave this building. Do it quietly and do it now." Dante's expression didn't change. This was why Adrian valued him. Understood. "And get me Marcus and 3 of the detail." Now Dante peeled away. Adrian continued toward the front of the chapel. Victoria watched him come, with that perfect smile, and he watched her watching him. And for a moment, he had the strange sensation of seeing a performance from the audience's side, the curtain pulled back just enough to reveal the mechanics behind the illusion. He stopped 6 feet from her. The music swelled and then faltered as the quartet noticed something had shifted. The officiant, a man named Father Callum, who had known Adrian's family for 30 years, glanced between them uncertainly. "Adrian," Victoria said. Her voice was warm, confident. "You look wonderful." "Victoria," he said, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly." Her smile flickered. "Just slightly." "Of course. Did you ever intend to actually be my wife?" The flickering stopped. The smile locked into place, not from warmth but from discipline, from the practiced reflex of a person who has been caught and is calculating their response in real time. "What kind of a question is that?" she asked. Her voice was still warm, but something underneath it had shifted. A register change that the guests wouldn't catch, but Adrian heard it clearly. A direct one. "Adrian, there are 400 people in this room. Answer the question, Victoria." The silence that followed lasted approximately 5 seconds. 5 seconds in which the quartet fell completely quiet. 5 seconds in which 400 people held a collective breath without knowing why. 5 seconds in which Victoria Belmont's expression changed slowly, like a mask being removed in poor lighting, from the warmth of a bride to something harder, colder, and in its own way almost relieved. "You found something," she said quietly. Not a question. Her eyes scanned the room briefly and then returned to his. "Was it one of ours or one of yours?" "Neither," Adrian said. "It was someone nobody bothered to watch." Something moved through Victoria's eyes, not fear exactly. Recalculation. She was already moving to the next position. "Whatever you think you've found," she said, her voice dropping so only he could hear, "consider what you're about to do. 400 witnesses, 2 families, years of negotiations, contracts, agreements." She paused. "You destroy this today, and you make enemies you cannot handle." "I already have enemies I can't handle," Adrian said. "The difference is that now I know who they are." He turned to face the room. What came next was something that people who were present in that chapel would describe for years afterward in different ways, depending on who they were and what they understood about the world they were standing in. Those who knew the Valenti name and what it meant understood immediately that something seismic had occurred. They sat very still. Those who were there as social guests, the politicians, the philanthropists, the people who had been invited for appearances rather than for access, simply understood that something had gone terribly wrong. Some of them reached for their phones before remembering they'd been asked to leave them at the door. Adrian stood at the front of that chapel and spoke clearly. "This wedding will not take place today," he said. "I want to thank everyone for coming. For your safety, and for reasons I'm unable to explain at this moment, I'm asking you to please exit through the main doors in an orderly fashion." The murmur that rose in response was immediate and enormous. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. From the corner of his eye, he saw Dante and 2 members of his security team positioning themselves near a group of men on the right side of the chapel, 4 men who had started to rise from their seats and then stopped when they understood what was surrounding them. Carlyle, Morano, DeLuca, Hendricks, his board members. the men who had been preparing to give his empire away. They sat back down. Victoria's father stood up from the front pew. He was a large man, red-faced, with the particular fury of someone who has never been publicly embarrassed and doesn't know what to do with the sensation. "Valenti," he said loudly enough to carry. "What in God's name?" "Sit down, Gerald," Adrian said. His voice was quiet. It always got quieter the more serious things became. "Your daughter and I will have a conversation. Your legal team and mine will have a conversation. But right now you will sit down." Gerald Belmont looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat down. The guests filed out over the next 15 minutes. Some of them moved quickly. Some of them moved slowly, looking backward, unwilling to miss whatever happened next. A few of the women were crying, some from shock, one or two, Adrian suspected, from something closer to vindication, the private satisfaction of women who had never trusted Victoria to begin with. When the chapel was empty except for the people Adrian had kept inside it, he turned back to Victoria. She had not moved from the altar. She was still standing in her wedding dress, surrounded by Italian roses, holding a bouquet she'd ordered from a designer in Milan. In the empty chapel, with the music gone and the guests gone and the performance stripped away, she looked different. Not smaller exactly. More real. "You want to know the honest answer to your question," she said. Her voice had dropped the warmth entirely. What was left was something more interesting, direct, precise, and in its own way almost admirable. "No, I didn't intend to be your wife. Not in any way that you would recognize as a marriage." She looked at him steadily. "But you should understand that what I built was intended to be better for your organization than what you were doing with it. Your family would have taken everything I built and used it to protect people who have been harming this city for 30 years, Adrian said. "I know what the Belmont alliances look like from the inside. Victoria, I did my research. I simply didn't look at the right research. Someone talked," she said. "It wasn't quite a question. Someone showed me the truth," he said. "There's a difference." Victoria tilted her head slightly. "Who?" "Someone you never thought to watch." Something shifted in her expression, not quite respect, but something in that general direction. The recognition of a move she hadn't anticipated. "You'll make enemies," she said again. But this time there was no threat in it. Just a statement of fact. "Yes," Adrian agreed. "I will. I've been making enemies my whole life. The difference is that going forward, I intend to make sure I know which ones are standing in front of me and which ones are standing beside me." He looked at her for one more long moment. Then he looked away. "My lawyers will be in touch," he said. "Please have your belongings removed from the residence by the end of the week." He walked toward the side door. Clara was in the small room where he'd sent her, a plain spacious that served as a storage room for the chapel, lined with folding chairs and cardboard boxes. She was sitting on a folding chair, her gray coat still on, her hands folded in her lap. She looked up when he opened the door. "It's done," he said. She absorbed that for a moment. The guests? Gone. The ceremony? Cancelled. Victoria? Still in the building. My team has her father contained. We have a great deal to discuss with both of them. Clara nodded slowly. She looked at her hands. "Are you all right?" The question surprised him. Not because it was unexpected, but because of the way she asked it. Without calculation. Without the awareness of how powerful he was, or what his answer might cost her. She asked it the way a person asks another person, simply and directly. "I don't know yet," he said, which was the honest answer. She nodded, as if that made sense. "That's fair." He leaned against the doorframe and studied her for a moment. "You realize what happens now. For you. The people inside your organization who were working with Victoria will know there was a leak. So they'll look for the source." "Yes. And since I'm the one who found the evidence, eventually they'll find me." "Yes," she absorbed that. "How long do I have before they figure it out? A few days, maybe less. Depending on how quickly they start working backward." Clara nodded again. She picked up her bag from the floor beside the chair and held it in her lap. She looked like someone making a mental list, quiet and practical, and not visibly afraid, though Adrian suspected she was. "I have a sister in Pennsylvania," she said. "I can go there." "You're not going anywhere without protection," he said. She looked up. "I'm not asking you for." "Know what you're not asking me for," he said. "I'm telling you. 4 years. You spent 4 years in my organization quietly doing work that 3 people before you died trying to finish. You walked into the most dangerous moment of my life this morning, alone, with nothing to gain, and you handed me evidence that saved my life." He paused. "You think I'm going to send you to your sister's house in Pennsylvania and hope for the best?" Clara stared at him. "You're offering me protection," she said. The surprise in her voice was genuine. "I'm telling you that you have it," he said, "whether you want it or not." For the first time since he'd met her in the 45 minutes, since he'd walked out of a chapel and found his life rearranging itself, around a gray-coated woman, with an envelope and exhausted eyes, Clara Whitmore looked like something in her had released. Not relief, exactly. More like the quiet exhaustion of someone who had been holding on for a very long time and had just discovered they were allowed to put something down. "Okay," she said. "Just that, okay." Adrian straightened from the doorframe. "Stay here. I'll send someone I trust to move you when it's time." "Who do you trust?" she asked. Not sarcastically. Genuinely. He thought about it. Given what the morning had revealed, the question carried more weight than it would have 3 hours ago. "Fewer people than I thought," he said. "But more than none." He started to leave, Mr. Valenti. He stopped, turned. Clara was looking at him with that same unreadable expression, the one that wasn't quite calm, wasn't quite afraid, was something in between that he didn't have a word for. "I'm sorry about the wedding," she said. "Not about stopping it, but about the fact that it happened at all, that someone you were supposed to be able to trust got that close." Adrian was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for what you did. I only did what someone should have done a long time ago." He looked at her for one final moment, this woman who had been invisible in his organization for 4 years, who had sat 2 desks down from a dead woman who brought bread on Fridays, who had spent years quietly mapping a conspiracy in an archives room where no one thought to look. The woman who had saved his life with an envelope and a steady voice. "Get some rest," he said. "We have a great deal of work ahead of us." Then he walked back into the wreckage of his wedding to begin the process of finding out how deep the damage went, and who, in the end, had truly been standing beside him all along. The first thing Adrian did when he walked back into the main body of the chapel was look at his 4 board members the way a surgeon looks at a scan, not with anger, not yet, but with the cold precision of someone identifying exactly where the damage was and how far it had spread. Carlyle sat in the 3rd pew, with his hands folded on his knees, projecting a calm that Adrian now recognized as rehearsed. Morano was beside him, already sweating despite the temperature in the room. DeLuca stared at the floor. Hendricks, the youngest of the 4, kept glancing toward the exits in a way that told Adrian everything he needed to know about which man would break first. Dante stood behind them with 2 members of the security detail, positioned with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this kind of thing before and felt nothing particular about doing it again. Gerald Belmont was still in the front pew. He had recovered some of his color and was sitting with his arms crossed radiating the particular fury of a man who believed his fury still meant something. Beside him, 2 of his associates' lawyers, from the look of them, were speaking to each other in low voices while pretending they weren't afraid. Victoria had not moved from the altar. Adrian looked at her across the length of the empty chapel, and she looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. It was the most honest exchange they'd ever had. Then he turned to Dante. "Separate rooms. All 4 of them. Nothing to eat or drink until I say so. Make sure they understand that their phones are not available to them." "Already done on the phones," Dante said. "Good." He looked at Hendricks one more time. "Start with him. He'll talk before the hour's up." Hendricks heard this. His jaw tightened. Adrian had not bothered to lower his voice. He walked past all of them without another word and moved toward the back office of the chapel, a small room that Father Callum used for private consultations and that Adrian had used, twice before in his life, for conversations that couldn't happen anywhere else. The priest himself had been quietly relocated the moment things began. Father Callum had known the Valenti family long enough to understand when God's house was being temporarily borrowed for secular purposes. Marcus, his head of security operations, was waiting inside. "Talk to me," Adrian said, closing the door behind him. Marcus was a broad man, careful in his movements, with a quality of stillness that came not from peace but from discipline. He had served in 2 different branches of military intelligence before Adrian found him and made him a better offer. He placed a single sheet of paper on the desk between them. 3 of the names on the documents, Clara Whitmore, gave you the internal sources. I've cross-referenced them against access logs from the last 18 months. He pointed to the paper. Every significant security breach we've experienced, every time information reached the wrong people, these 3 names appear in the system within 48 hours prior. Every single time. Adrian studied the paper. One of the names was someone he'd known for 7 years. A man named Cole, who had run his Eastern logistics operations with a precision Adrian had always attributed to competence, who had sat at his dinner table, who had come to his mother's birthday last spring and brought flowers. Cole, Adrian said quietly. Yes. How long based on the access logs? Minimum 2 years, possibly longer. Marcus paused. There are 6 months of records from before our current logging system was implemented. He may have been operational before we can trace. Adrian set the paper down. He thought about the last 2 years, the near misses he'd attributed to bad luck, the deals that had fallen apart for reasons he'd never fully understood, the 2 occasions when competitors had moved against him with information that could only have come from inside. He had spent months after each incident looking in the wrong direction, because Cole had always been in the right direction, and Adrian had never looked there. Where is he now? He was at the ceremony. He left when the guests were dismissed. He ran. Yes, Adrian absorbed that. A man who runs confirms everything. Find him, already working on it. Marcus folded the paper and tucked it into his jacket. There's something else. There always is. The woman. Clara Whitmore. Marcus met his eyes steadily. Before you make decisions about her continued involvement, I think you should know what she did. Not just what she found. What she actually did to get it. Adrian said nothing. He waited. She's been building that file for approximately 2 years, Marcus said. She wasn't just looking at documents that crossed her desk in archives. She was actively reconstructing records that had been deliberately destroyed. Financial records that were deleted from primary servers. She found backup fragments in deprecated systems and rebuilt them manually. Correspondence that was never supposed to exist in digital form. She tracked physical copies through courier logs. He paused. She's not just detail-oriented, Mr. Valenti. She's exceptional. What she built in that file is the kind of work that would have taken a full intelligence team 6 months with proper resources. Adrian was quiet for a moment. She did this alone, he said. Far as I can determine, completely alone. Another pause. 3 people inside your organization reached similar conclusions before her. All 3 of them, at the point where they had enough to bring forward, appear to have been identified and eliminated. He said it plainly, without sentiment. Clara Whitmore survived because she never reached that point. She kept gathering. She kept waiting. And she never told a single person what she was doing. 4 years, Adrian said. 4 years. He thought about the woman sitting in the storage room with her folded hands in her gray coat, telling him she just wanted to go back to her desk. She's in the east storage room, he said. I want 2 people I personally trust on that door. If anyone asks why she's there, the answer is that she's a witness to a legal matter and is being held for her own protection. That answer goes to no one who doesn't already know the full picture. Understood. And get her food, Adrian said. She looks like she hasn't eaten since yesterday. Marcus nodded once and moved toward the door. Marcus. He stopped. The 3 people who were killed before her, Holt, Reyes, and Destin. I want their files on my desk tonight. Complete files. Everything. Marcus looked at him. You believe they were deliberately targeted. I believe, Adrian said carefully, that I need to know what happened inside my own organization, and I need to know it from the beginning. Marcus left. Adrian stood in the small office alone for approximately 30 seconds. Then he sat down, picked up a pen, and began making a list of every decision he needed to make in the next 4 hours. Because that was how he had always handled moments when the ground shifted beneath him, not by standing still, not by reacting, but by moving forward with enough deliberateness that momentum itself became a kind of control. The list was longer than he expected. He spoke to Hendricks first, as he'd planned. The youngest board member was brought into the office 17 minutes after Adrian sent Marcus to find him. He arrived looking like a man who had been arguing with himself the entire time and had not resolved the argument. He was 41 years old, Harvard educated, had joined the board 3 years ago on Carlyle's recommendation. In those 3 years, Adrian had trusted him with operational oversight of 2 significant expansion projects, and had never had any reason to question his loyalty. Which was, Adrian now understood, precisely why he'd been recruited. Hendricks sat down across the desk. He opened his mouth. "Before you say anything," Adrian said, "I want you to understand something. I already have the documents. I already have the access logs. I already have the correspondence between your personal email and Ferrara's legal office." He let that land. "The only question left to answer is what you want your story to be." Hendricks closed his mouth. Then he opened it again. "I didn't know about the honeymoon," he said. "I want you to understand that. The contracts I agreed to, the restructuring plan. I thought it was a business decision. I thought it was coming from you. Carlyle told me you had already approved the framework and just needed the board to." He stopped. He heard himself. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like you agreed to something you didn't fully investigate," Adrian said. "It sounds like someone gave you a profitable reason not to ask questions and you chose not to ask them." Hendricks looked at the desk. "Yes. What was your profitable reason?" A pause. "Ferrara's group was going to bring a pharmaceutical distribution contract to my private firm, worth approximately $14 million over 3 years. $14 million, Adrian repeated. He didn't say anything else for a moment. "And what did you think was going to happen to me while Ferrara's group and the Belmont family were restructuring my organization?" "I thought," Hendricks stopped again, "I thought you would still be in control. I thought it was just a realignment. I didn't think anyone was going to—" "3 people in my organization are dead, Hendricks." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Hendricks sat very still. His face went through several things in rapid succession: disbelief, then the specific horror of someone who suddenly understands the full dimensions of something they told themselves was smaller. "I didn't know that," he said. His voice had changed. "I swear to you, I didn't know that." Adrian looked at him for a long time. "Write it down," he said finally. He pushed a legal pad across the desk. "Everything. Every conversation, every name, every date, every number that changed hands. Everything." He stood. "You have 2 hours. When I come back, if that pad has everything that's actually on it, and not just what you're comfortable putting on it, we'll talk about what happens next. If it doesn't—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. He walked out and left Hendricks with the legal pad and the silence. Carlyle was harder. Carlyle was 63 years old and had been in Adrian's father's organization before he was in Adrian's. He had survived the elder Valenti's death and the transition of power that followed with a smoothness that Adrian had always interpreted as loyalty and now understood differently. He sat in the borrowed room with the composure of a man who had been in dangerous situations before and had learned to outlast them. "You've been busy this morning," Carlyle said when Adrian walked in. "I have. Ending your own wedding. Detaining your board." He shook his head slightly. "Your father would have handled this differently." "My father," Adrian said, "is dead." He sat down, and I'm beginning to wonder how much of what happened to him was handled by people in this room. Something moved through Carlyle's eyes. It was quick, and he controlled it fast, but Adrian had been watching for it. "That's an extraordinary accusation," Carlyle said. "It's an extraordinary morning." Adrian leaned forward slightly. "Here's what I know, Carlyle. I know you've been in contact with Ferrara's people for at least 2 years. I know you signed a preliminary agreement on the corporate restructuring 6 weeks ago. I know that 3 of my employees are dead. And I know that the access logs from my own security system put you in a position to know things that reached my enemies on at least 14 separate occasions." He paused. "What I don't know yet is how far back it goes, whether it started with Victoria's people or whether it started long before that." Carlyle said nothing. "My father's death," Adrian said. "Was it natural?" The silence stretched out between them like something physical. "Carlyle, you don't want to open that door," Carlyle said quietly. It wasn't quite a threat. It wasn't quite a warning. It was the voice of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was trying to decide whether to set it down. "The door is already open," Adrian said. "Someone opened it this morning before I had the chance. I'm just walking through it." He held the older man's gaze. "Tell me what you know about my father." Carlyle looked at the wall for a long moment. Then he looked back at Adrian. "Your father found out," he said finally. About the early contact with Ferrara's people. This was 4 years ago. Before you were fully in control. Before the organization was yours in anything more than name. He stopped. He found out and he didn't go public with it because he was afraid of what a public fracture would do to the family. To you. He was trying to protect the transition. And he made a private arrangement. He agreed to stay quiet in exchange for certain guarantees about your safety and the stability of the organization. Carlyle's voice was flat, distant. 3 months later, he was dead. The room was completely silent. They killed him, Adrian said. There was no— Carlyle stopped. Started again. There was no single decision. There was a situation in which your father became inconvenient to certain interests, and those interests had the capacity to resolve inconvenience. I was not part of that decision. I want that on record. You knew about it afterward. A long pause. Yes, and you said nothing. I had a family, Carlyle said. I had. Everyone has something they're protecting, Adrian said. His voice was very quiet. That's what they count on. He stood. You'll write it down. All of it. Including what you know about my father. Including who made the decision and who carried it out. Including every name you have. And then he paused at the door. And then we'll see what justice looks like for a man who knew a murder happened and said nothing for 4 years. He left Carlyle with the legal pad. In the hallway, he stopped walking. He stood with his back against the wall and breathed slowly for approximately 10 seconds. His father had known, had tried to protect him, had died for it, and Adrian had spent 4 years building an empire on top of a foundation that was rotten from the beginning, surrounded by men who had let him do it because it was useful and comfortable and profitable for them to let him believe he was in control. He breathed out. Then he pushed off the wall and kept moving. He went back to Clara. He wasn't sure why there were 20 other things that required his attention, 20 other conversations that needed to happen. But when he reached the intersection in the corridor where he could go left toward Morano and DeLuca or right toward the storage room, he turned right. The 2 men he'd positioned outside the door stepped aside without being asked. He knocked once. Opened the door. Clara was no longer sitting in the folding chair. She was standing near the back wall, and she had apparently been reading. She was holding what looked like a small notebook, the kind people carry in coat pockets, and she closed it when he entered with the quick reflex of someone accustomed to putting things away before they're seen. Someone had brought her food. A plate sat on a folding table half-eaten, which at least meant she'd tried. She'd also taken off the gray coat. Without it, she looked smaller and somehow less defended. You spoke to them, she said. It wasn't a question. She could read it on him, apparently. Starting to. He looked at the notebook. What are you writing? Notes. A pause. I take notes on things. It's a habit. What kind of notes? Anything I might need to remember later. She set it on the table beside the plate. Did Hendricks talk? He's talking now and writing. He paused. You knew it would be him first. He was the one who always looked the most uncomfortable at board presentations, she said. Like he was waiting for something to go wrong and didn't entirely want it to. She looked at him steadily. People who are fully committed to a thing don't look like that. People who are in over their head do. Adrian watched her for a moment. How do you know what he looked like at board presentations? Archives doesn't sit in on board meetings. Something crossed her face, a flicker of something that might have been discomfort. I used to deliver documents to the anteroom before the presentations. I could see in through the glass. A beat. I paid attention to people. It's something I do. I'm beginning to understand that. He pulled over the other folding chair and sat down. He wasn't sure what made him do it. He had not sat in a folding chair in years, and the gesture was not something he would have predicted of himself an hour ago. But the morning had unraveled the predictable in ways that were still working through his system. Carlyle told me something about my father. Clara's expression shifted. I know, he looked up. You know, it's in the envelope, the last section. I didn't highlight it because I wasn't sure. She hesitated. I wasn't sure how much you were ready to take in at once. I thought you could read it when you were alone. Adrian stared at her. You knew about my father, and you made the decision not to tell me this morning. I made the decision to make sure you were alive first, Clara said steadily. The wedding was the immediate crisis. Your father is. She stopped. Your father is a wound. Wounds need the right moment. I didn't think the right moment was 30 seconds before your wedding." She met his eyes. "I'm sorry if that was the wrong call." He sat with that for a moment. "It wasn't the wrong call," he said. She nodded once. "How long have you known about my father?" "I suspected for about a year. I had enough to be fairly certain for about 4 months." She looked at the table. "I'm sorry. I know that's not easy to hear. Nothing about today has been easy to hear." He looked at his hands. "What else is in the envelope that you didn't show me this morning?" Clara picked up the gray coat from the back of the chair and reached into the inside pocket. She pulled out a second, smaller envelope, the same color, the same texture, sealed differently. She held it out to him. "The names of the people who were directly involved in your father's death," she said. "The communication trail. The financial transaction that changed hands afterward." She paused. "3 of the names are people you still interact with regularly." The envelope. He didn't open it yet. "Clara." She looked at him. "Why did you wait? You had this for 4 months. You could have come to me 4 months ago." "I thought about it," she said. "I almost did 3 times." She was quiet for a moment. "But each time I looked at how the information had reached me, through the same system that was being monitored, through channels that were being watched, I realized that if I came to you before the evidence was complete and airtight, I would be dead within a week and everything I'd found would disappear. And the wedding was the deadline." "The honeymoon was the deadline," she corrected gently. "Once you were on that trip, there was no bringing you back." She paused. "So I had to come before the trip. And the only time I knew with absolute certainty where you would be, when I could reach you directly, before your security filtered everything, was this morning." Adrian looked at her. "You timed it," he said. "You planned this down to the day." "The hour," Clara said. "I needed to catch you before you were inside the building, surrounded by all of them. Once you walked through those chapel doors, I couldn't have reached you." She looked at him with those exhausted, steady eyes. "So I stood outside for 40 minutes, and I waited." He thought about the image of her standing against that wall, gray coat, cold morning, an envelope full of evidence that 3 people had died trying to assemble, waiting for the one moment when she could place it in the right hands. "You were terrified," he said. "Yes," she said simply. "Completely. But you waited anyway. Someone had to." The words landed the way they had the first time she'd said something like them, with a simplicity that made them heavier than complicated things, the kind of simple truth that sits with you long after elaborate arguments have dissolved. Adrian opened the second envelope. He read through it, methodically, the way he read everything, not fast, not slow, with the focused attention of someone who understands that speed in these moments is a form of disrespect to what you're reading. Clara sat quietly. She didn't watch him. She looked at the wall, giving him the privacy of the information. When he finished, he set the pages down on the table between them. 2 of the 3 names he'd recognized immediately. One of them was a man who had shaken his hand at his father's funeral and told him that his father had been the most honorable man he'd ever known. "The 3rd name," he said. He pointed to it. "I don't recognize this one." "He's not inside your organization," Clara said. "He's a contracted intermediary. He operates out of Miami. He's been used by Ferrara's group for this kind of work at least 4 times in the last decade. Based on what I could piece together." She paused. "He's careful, but not as careful as he thinks. You have enough on him. Enough for a legal case? Probably not yet. Enough for..." She stopped. "Enough to be useful to someone who knows how to handle what I have." Adrian looked at her. "You're talking about giving me enough to move against him outside legal channels." "I'm talking about giving you the truth," Clara said quietly. "What you do with it is your decision. It always has been." He folded the pages carefully and put them back in the envelope. Outside the storage room, through the thin walls of the chapel, he could hear the muffled sounds of the building working, his people moving, low voices, the controlled machinery of a situation being managed. Somewhere in this building, 4 men were writing down their confessions. Somewhere, Gerald Belmont was furious and frightened, and trying to calculate his next move. Somewhere, Victoria was sitting in a wedding dress, surrounded by Italian roses, and running her own calculations. And in here, in a storage room full of folding chairs, Adrian Valenti was sitting across from a woman who had spent 4 years of her quiet life dismantling the machinery of his destruction, piece by piece, alone, and had asked for nothing in return. Carlyle told me my father tried to protect me, Adrian said. He found out about the corruption, and he stayed quiet to protect the transition. To protect me. Yes, Clara said. And they killed him for it. Yes. He looked at the wall for a long moment. He died thinking he'd protected me, not knowing that the thing he was protecting me from was still there. Clara didn't say anything. There was nothing to say to that, and she was wise enough to know it. He spent his whole life building something for me to inherit, Adrian said. And what he actually handed me was a house with the foundation already burning. He paused, and I walked in and thought I was doing well, because the walls were still standing. The walls were still standing because of you, Clara said. What you built in the last 4 years, the legitimate operations, the expansions, the relationships, those were real. The corruption was underneath it. But what you put on top of it was yours. I built it on a lie. You built it without knowing, she said. That's different. She looked at him steadily. The question isn't what you built on a bad foundation. The question is what you do now that you know what the foundation actually is. Adrian turned to look at her. She held his gaze without flinching. No calculation, no performance. Just a woman who had said what she believed, and was willing to sit with whatever came of it. You're not afraid of me, he said. Of course I'm afraid of you, she said immediately. You're one of the most dangerous men in this city. But not right now. She thought about it. Right now you're a man who just found out his father was murdered, and his wedding was a trap, she said. Right now you're just a person. A beat. People don't scare me the same way powerful men do. Something moved through him that he couldn't entirely name, not quite warmth, not quite recognition. Something in the space between them that was newer than either. My father would have liked you, he said quietly. The realization hit him as he said it. Clara looked slightly surprised. Why? He respected people who said what they meant. He stood. It was rare in his world. It's rare in mine. He picked up the envelope from the table. Get some rest. Genuinely. I'll have someone bring you whatever you need. I don't need much, I know. He moved toward the door, then stopped. The notebook. The one you closed when I came in. Clara glanced at the table where she'd set it. What's in it? He asked. A pause. Everything I couldn't put in the official documents, she said carefully. Names I suspected but couldn't prove. Patterns I noticed but couldn't substantiate. Guesses. Another pause, informed guesses. I want to see it, he said. When you're ready. She looked at him for a moment. Not yet, she said. He blinked. In his experience, people did not tell him not yet. In his experience, people gave him what he asked for immediately, because the alternative was not something they wanted to encounter. But Clara Whitmore was looking at him with a quiet, level steadiness that wasn't defiance exactly, more like the particular confidence of someone who has decided where their line is and has no intention of stepping over it. When it's time, she said. I'll know. Adrian looked at her for one long moment. Then he nodded. All right, he said. He walked out. In the corridor, he stopped and stood for a moment, the second envelope in his hand, the weight of the morning settling into something he would be carrying for a long time. The names of the men who had killed his father, the confession of a board member who had sold him for $14 million, the story of a woman who had spent 4 years being invisible in order to save his life. He had entered this building this morning believing he knew exactly who he was and exactly what his world contained. He was walking through it now with almost none of those certainties intact. But for the first time in 4 years, maybe in longer than that, he understood with complete clarity who in his world was telling him the truth. And that, he thought, was the beginning of something. Not the beginning of a plan. Not the beginning of a strategy. The beginning of whatever it was going to take to tear the rotted foundation out and build something that could actually hold the weight of what he wanted his life to become. He tucked the envelope into his jacket. He went to find Morano. Morano broke in 11 minutes. Adrian had not expected that. Of the 4 board members, Morano had always struck him as the most composed under pressure, a man who had navigated 30 years of dangerous business by staying unremarkable, by never being the loudest voice or the most visible target. He was the kind of man who survived by being useful enough to keep and forgettable enough to overlook. But the moment Adrian sat down across from him and placed Clara's documents on the table between them, not all of them, just the 3 pages most directly connected to Morano's name, something in the older man simply gave way. Not dramatically, not with tears or raised voices. More like a wall that had been holding against water for too long and finally ran out of resistance. "I want to talk to someone," Morano said. "A lawyer." "You'll have that opportunity," Adrian said. "After you talk to me." "That's not—" Morano, Adrian's voice was quiet. It was always quiet. "You signed your name to documents that helped engineer my death. You've known for 2 years that 3 people inside my organization were killed to protect that secret. You've been sitting at my board table, eating at my restaurants, accepting my trust and my compensation, while carrying all of that." He let the silence sit for a moment. "The lawyer conversation will happen. Right now, you and I are going to have a different one." Morano looked at the documents. He looked at his hands. He looked at the wall. "Carlyle brought me in," he said finally, 3 years ago. "He said it was a restructuring plan. He said you had already agreed to the framework. He said it was a business evolution, that the Belmont partnership would open channels we'd never had access to." He stopped. "He said you knew. He told Hendricks the same thing," Adrian said. Morano looked up. "Hendricks is talking?" "Hendricks is filling a legal pad." He watched the older man's face. "How many other people did Carlyle recruit with that story that I had already approved?" Morano was quiet for a moment. "I know of 2 others. Outside the board, people in operational roles." He paused. "I can give you the names." "You will give me the names." Adrian gathered the documents. "What about the 3 employees who were killed? Did Carlyle tell you about that?" Something painful moved through Morano's face. "He told me there had been a security issue, that people inside the organization were selling information to competitors and had to be removed." He stopped again. "I chose to believe that. I know how that sounds." "It sounds like you made a comfortable choice," Adrian said. Morano nodded, slowly, with the exhausted honesty of a man who has run out of comfortable alternatives. "Yes, it does." Adrian stood. "Write the names. Write everything you know about who Carlyle recruited, what they were told and what they agreed to. And then write what you actually understood about what was happening, not what you allowed yourself to believe." He moved toward the door. "The difference between those 2 things will matter a great deal in what comes next." He left Morano with the legal pad and moved down the corridor, and as he moved, he was already running the numbers in his head, the scope of what Carlyle had built, the patience it must have taken, the specific kind of cruelty involved in using loyalty as a cover story for a plan designed to end in his death. DeLuca was last. DeLuca was the simplest, which was its own kind of revelation. He had not been recruited by Carlyle. He had been recruited by Victoria directly 18 months ago at a charity event where he'd had too much to drink and said things he shouldn't have said to a woman who was better at listening than he understood. She had used those things against him, quietly, efficiently, with the precision Adrian now recognized as her actual defining quality. DeLuca had not signed the restructuring agreement because he believed in the plan. He had signed it because Victoria had made him understand that if he didn't, his private indiscretions would reach his wife and his business partners simultaneously. He was the least culpable of the 4, and also somehow the most pathetic, a man who had handed over a piece of Adrian's empire because he was ashamed of himself and someone had found that shame and used it like a tool. Adrian left him with the legal pad and felt nothing in particular about his situation. Shame was a vulnerability. Everyone in his world knew that. Using other people's shame against them was not even unusual. It was simply how certain games were played. What he felt something about was the fact that Victoria had been playing this game for at least 18 months before he had any idea the game existed. He went to find her. Victoria was alone in the main chapel when he returned to it. Someone had found her a chair, and she was sitting near the altar, still in the wedding dress, with a composure that Adrian had to acknowledge, even now, was impressive. She was not crying. She was not pacing. She was not doing any of the things people do when they are afraid. She was reading something on a small notepad she'd apparently had in her dress, and she set it face down on her knee when he entered, without haste. "Your lawyers will be here within the hour," she said. "Your people told mine. My lawyers will be here within the hour," Adrian confirmed. He pulled a chair from a nearby pew and placed it facing hers and sat down. "Your lawyers will be here when I decide they will." Something flickered in her eyes. She was recalculating again. She was always recalculating. Adrian. She used his name with a practiced warmth, that he now heard as clearly constructed as the dress she was wearing. Whatever you found this morning, whatever someone told you, I want you to understand that there is still a version of this that works for both of us. There isn't, he said pleasantly. The contracts haven't been executed. The restructuring hasn't been filed. Nothing is legally. 3 people are dead, Victoria. She stopped. The silence was different from the silences earlier in the morning. Earlier, the silences had been filled with the processing of information, the recalibration of positions. This silence was emptier. Something had shifted in the room. That has nothing to do with. Their names were Robert Holt, Sandra Reyes, and Paul Destin. He said the names clearly, with the deliberateness of someone who wants names to be heard, not absorbed into abstraction. Robert Holt had worked in my accounting division for 6 years. Sandra Reyes sat 2 desks down from the person who ultimately uncovered your plan. Paul Destin was 27 years old. He looked at her steadily. They died because they found pieces of what you built, and you needed those pieces to stay hidden. I did not order. Someone in your network did, he said. And your network is your responsibility. You know that. You've known that your entire life. It's the same standard your father applies. It's the standard I apply. You don't get to build something and then stand outside its consequences. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. The warmth was entirely gone now. What remained was something harder and, in its own way, more honest than anything she'd shown him in the entire length of their engagement. You want to know if I feel guilty, she said. I want to know if you're capable of it, he said. Another silence. Longer this time. I didn't know about the 3 employees until it was done, she said finally. That's the truth. I knew it was being handled. I didn't ask the specifics. She paused. And I understand that distinction doesn't matter to you. I'm telling you anyway, because it's what's true. The distinction matters, Adrian said. It tells me what kind of person you are. Not the kind who gives explicit orders to kill quiet employees in an archives department. The kind who creates the conditions for it to happen and looks away. He tilted his head slightly. I'm not sure which is worse. Something in Victoria's expression broke, very slightly, very quickly, and then closed again. What do you want, Adrian? You've ended the wedding. You have the board. You have whatever your anonymous source gave you. What else is there? I want to understand one thing, he said. Genuinely. Not for legal purposes. Not as a negotiation. He looked at her directly. Was there any point, any moment in the last 2 years where you thought about stopping? Where you considered that what you were building toward was something you didn't want to finish? Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Then, to his considerable surprise, she said, yes. He waited, about 8 months ago, she said. We had dinner. You remember the one in March? The restaurant in the village you'd been trying to get a reservation at for 6 months. She looked at the floor. You were tired that night. Not performing. Just tired. And you talked about your father. You didn't talk about him often. But that night you did. You talked about what he'd wanted for the organization. What he believed it could become. She paused. And I sat there and thought, he doesn't know. He genuinely doesn't know what's underneath any of this. And he's carrying all of it anyway. Another pause. I thought about telling you. Adrian stared at her. But you didn't, he said. No. She looked up. Because by then, too many things were already in motion. Because I'd made commitments to my father's network that couldn't be unmade. Because the cost of stopping was higher than I was willing to pay. She looked at him with the most unguarded expression he'd ever seen on her face. I chose the cost over the confession, and I've been making that choice every day since. The chapel was very quiet. Outside, the city moved on the way cities do, indifferent, continuous, unaware that something seismic had happened inside one of its buildings on a Tuesday morning. Traffic, voices, the ordinary mechanical rhythm of a world that didn't pause for reckoning. Thank you, Adrian said finally. She looked surprised. For what? For answering honestly. He stood. My lawyers will be here in an hour. Your father is being kept comfortable. You'll have the opportunity to speak with him before anyone else speaks with either of you. He paused. I'm not going to pretend this ends well for your family, Victoria. But I'm also not going to make it worse than it has to be. The 3 people who were killed, I want accountability for that. Everything else is negotiable. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. You're serious. About which part? That you'll negotiate. That there's a version of this that doesn't destroy everything. There are people who knew, and people who acted, he said. I understand the difference. My lawyers will explain what that means in practical terms. He moved toward the main doors. For what it's worth, the dinner in March. I remember it. I was tired, and the conversation about my father was real. He paused without turning around. I wish you'd said something. He walked out before she could respond. Marcus met him in the outer corridor, with the expression of a man carrying more than one piece of news and sorting through which to deliver first. Cole, Adrian said immediately. You found him. We found where he was, Marcus said. He cleared out of his apartment approximately 4 hours ago. Took a go bag. His car is at JFK. He's running. He tried to. He's in a holding pattern. Marcus's voice was carefully neutral. Our people at the airport intercepted him before he could board. He's being held in a secure location. Adrian absorbed that. Does he know we have the documents? He does now. He made 2 calls before our people reached him. One to a number registered to Ferrara's Miami office. One to a burner that we haven't traced yet. He paused. The Miami call was 22 seconds. Long enough to warn someone. Ferrara knows the operation is compromised.
Yes.
Adrian thought for a moment. Then we have a limited window before Ferrara decides that cutting his losses is worth more than whatever he was going to gain from this. He looked at Marcus. How long before he moves against us directly? If he believes everything is already exposed. Hours. Maybe less. A pause. He'll want to eliminate the evidence source if he can identify it. The evidence source. Clara. Lock down the east storage room, Adrian said. His voice had gone flat in a way Marcus recognized. 2 more people on that door. No one goes in or out without my personal authorization. And I mean no one, not Dante, not you, not anyone with a friendly face and a reasonable excuse. Understood. Marcus was already reaching for his phone. There's one more thing. Adrian waited. We pulled Clara Whitmore's background. Full background, not just her employment file. He handed over a folded sheet. I think you should know who she is before you make decisions about how much access to give her. Adrian unfolded the sheet and read it. He read it twice. Then he looked up at Marcus with an expression that was difficult to read, even for a man who had spent years reading him. Her father, Adrian said. Yes. Thomas Whitmore. Yes. He looked back at the sheet. Thomas Whitmore had been a federal investigator 15 years ago who had spent 4 years building a case against the Ferrara network, the same network now trying to destroy what Adrian had built. The case had been extraordinary by all accounts. Meticulous. Comprehensive. The kind of work that would have dismantled an entire criminal infrastructure from the inside. It never made it to trial. Thomas Whitmore had been killed in a car accident on the interstate outside Richmond, Virginia, 8 days before his case was scheduled to go before a grand jury. He was 44 years old. His daughter Clara was 19. Ferrara's network, Adrian said. Almost certainly, Marcus said. It was never proven. The accident investigation found nothing actionable. But the timing, Adrian said quietly. He folded the sheet. He stood in the corridor for a long moment, turning this new information against everything else he knew, fitting it into the shape of the morning, feeling the way it changed the weight and dimension of things. Clara Whitmore had spent 4 years in his organization, not simply because she believed someone had to do what she did. She had spent 4 years inside the network, adjacent to the one that had killed her father, patiently and invisibly assembling the evidence that a federal investigation had died trying to gather. She wasn't just brave. She had a reason that went back 15 years and was still running, and she had never said a word about it. He went back to the storage room. The 2 additional guards stepped aside. He knocked once, opened the door. Clara was sitting on the floor this time, her back against the wall, legs folded, the notebook open in her lap. She closed it again when she saw him, but this time she didn't put it away. She held it against her chest instead and looked at him, and he could see immediately that she read something in his face, the change that the sheet of paper in his jacket had put there. You know about my father, she said. Not a question. A recognition. I do, he said. He pulled the folding chair over and sat close to the floor, which put them at roughly the same level. I should have known sooner. I didn't tell you because it wasn't relevant, she said. It's entirely relevant. To my motivation, she said. Not to the evidence. The evidence is true whether my father was killed by Ferrara's people or whether I found it for any other reason. She looked at him directly. I didn't want you to discount what I gave you because you thought it was personal. Isn't it personal? Of course it's personal, she said, and her voice didn't break, but it came close, closer than anything all morning. He was my father. He spent 4 years building a case that was going to matter, and someone killed him 8 days before it could. She paused. I was 19. I had to identify his body in a hospital in Virginia, and then go home and figure out how to tell my sister. She stopped, breathed. So yes, it's the most personal thing I've ever done in my life. She said it the way people say things they've been carrying for a very long time, with a kind of exhausted clarity, the relief and the weight of it existing in the same breath. That's why you came to me specifically, Adrian said slowly. Not just because of Victoria's plan. Because my organization sits adjacent to Ferrara's network. Because the people inside it who were working with Ferrara were the same network that killed your father. Yes, she said simply. You used my organization to finish what he started. I used the access I had, she said, which was your archives department. She looked at him. I didn't plan it that way from the beginning. I applied for the job because I needed work and I was qualified and your organization was hiring. But once I was inside and I started seeing the patterns, she stopped. I recognized the architecture, the same financial structures, the same communication patterns, the same methods. It was the same network, just 15 years older and smarter. Her jaw tightened slightly, and I thought, I have access. I have skills. And I have absolutely nothing to lose. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. You had your life to lose, he said. My father gave his life, trying to do this, she said. I wasn't going to do less. The silence between them was different from the silences earlier in the day. Those had been tactical solstices where information was being processed, positions recalculated. This silence had a different quality. Something older and heavier and more human. Clara. She looked at him. What you built, the documents, the reconstruction of deleted records, the traced communications, your father's original case. Do you have access to what remains of it? She hesitated. Then she reached into the inside pocket of the gray coat, which was hanging on the back of the chair, and pulled out a USB drive. I've had it for 12 years, she said. I pulled everything from his home office the week after he died, before his colleagues could come and take it. She turned it over in her fingers. It's encrypted. He taught me the key when I was 16, as a kind of joke. He said everyone should know how to keep their secrets safe. She paused. I don't think it was a joke. Adrian stared at the drive. 12 years. She'd carried it for 12 years. That combined with what you've built in the last 4 years, he said, would be comprehensive enough for a federal case that cannot be dismissed, she said quietly. Yes, that's the idea. She looked at him steadily. That's been the idea for the last 2 years. You were building toward a federal case, he said. Not just bringing information to me. I was building toward the truth, having a permanent home where it couldn't be buried, she said. Bringing it to you was the first step. What happens next is yours to decide. Adrian sat back in the chair. Outside, Marcus's phone calls were already rippling through the organization guards repositioning, communication channels being secured, the quiet, efficient machinery of containment in motion. Somewhere in the city, Ferrara was receiving news that his operation had been exposed and calculating his response. Cole was in a holding location, choosing between cooperation and consequences. The 4 board members were filling legal pads with the details of their individual betrayals. Victoria was sitting in a wedding dress with the wreckage of 18 months of planning around her. And in here, in a storage room with folding chairs, a woman was holding a USB drive that contained her father's life's work. I want to help you finish it, Adrian said. Clara looked at him. The surprise on her face was genuine and unguarded the first time all morning he'd managed to say something she hadn't anticipated. You want to help me build a federal case, she said carefully, against the same network you've been managing relationships with for 4 years. Against the people who killed your father, he said. Against the people who killed 3 of my employees. Against the people who spent 2 years trying to engineer my death through a woman I was supposed to trust. He looked at her evenly. And yes, against relationships I've maintained, because I didn't understand what they were until today. Because someone showed me. Clara was very quiet. If you do that, she said slowly, you expose yourself. Your own history with those networks. Your own decisions. I know. You could lose the organization. Parts of it, at least. The parts that can't survive scrutiny. I know. You could be prosecuted. I know that too. He said it without hesitation. I have lawyers who are very good at making distinctions between what I knew and when I knew it. And I have the advantage of being the person who comes forward versus the person who gets caught. He paused. I've also been making a list, for the last 4 hours, of the decisions I've made that I can defend and the ones I can't. The list I can defend is longer than I expected. He paused again. And the list I can't defend, I'd rather deal with it honestly than keep building on top of it. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Your father's words from that dinner in March, she said quietly, about what he believed the organization could become. Adrian went still. How do you know what I said that dinner? Something crossed Clara's face. Something careful. The restaurant had a private dining room with a shared wall, she said. I was working late, following a lead on one of the communication trails. I was in the adjacent room. A pause. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was leaving when I heard your voice. I stopped. She looked at him. I heard you talk about your father, about what he wanted, and I thought, she stopped. I thought he actually wants something different. He's just surrounded by people who are using that wanting against him. Adrian stared at her. She had been in that restaurant. She had heard that conversation. The real one, the tired one, the one where he'd said things he didn't say in rooms full of people who were watching to see which way he leaned. You've been watching me for 4 years, he said. I've been watching everyone for 4 years, she said. But yes, you too, she looked at him squarely. I needed to know if you were the kind of person who would do something with what I brought you, or if you were the kind who would take it and bury it to protect himself. She paused. That dinner was the first time I was fairly certain which kind you were. And were you right? Clara looked at the USB drive in her hand. She looked at the man sitting across from her in a folding chair in a chapel storage room, with the envelope of evidence about his father's murder in his jacket, and a wedding ended, and 4 board members confessing in adjacent rooms, and a network of betrayal unraveling around him in real time. She said, ask me again in 6 months. Despite everything, despite the weight of the morning, the exhaustion, the accumulated gravity of everything that had shifted and been remade since dawn. Adrian almost smiled. Fair enough, he said. He stood, he held out his hand. Clara looked at it for a moment. Then she placed the USB drive in his palm. My father's case is on there, she said. Under a folder called Thomas. The encryption key is, she told him, 7 characters, 1 number, a name he didn't recognize but filed immediately. Don't write it down. I never write things down, he said. I know. She looked at him steadily. I know a great deal about how you operate, Mr. Valenti. I've spent 4 years learning it. Adrian, he said. She blinked. My name is Adrian, he said. I think, given the current circumstances, you've earned the use of it. Something shifted in her expression, small, controlled, but real. All right, she said. Adrian. He closed his hand around the drive. The next sound that reached them was not one he expected. It was Marcus, running, not the measured, urgent walk of a man managing a situation, but actually running, which was something Adrian had never seen him do, which meant something was wrong at a level beyond management. Marcus hit the door without knocking. Ferrara's people, he said. His breathing was controlled but fast. 3 vehicles. They're a block out. He looked at Adrian. They're not coming to negotiate. Adrian turned to Clara. She had gone very still. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of someone absorbing information and calculating, the same quality he'd seen in her all morning, the same particular intelligence that had kept her alive for 4 years in a world designed to not notice her. The warehouse on Crane Street, she said. There's a secondary access route through the loading. You know the Crane Street warehouse, Adrian said. It was not a question. I know all your secondary locations, she said. I told you. 4 years. He looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he moved. On me, he said to Marcus. And to Clara, stay close. Don't stop moving regardless of what you hear. Clara stood. She picked up her gray coat. She didn't ask questions and she didn't hesitate. And the 3 of them moved out of the storage room and into whatever the next hour was going to bring the woman who knew everything, the man who had finally started listening, and the truth between them that 3 people had already died to keep buried. It was not going to be buried today. They moved through the chapel's service corridors fast and without noise. Adrian in front, Marcus behind Clara, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by the thick walls of a building that had held heavier secrets than theirs for over a century. Adrian's mind was running 2 tracks simultaneously, the immediate, which was getting out of the building without being intercepted, and the strategic, which was understanding what Ferrara's decision to send 3 vehicles meant about how much he knew and how quickly he'd moved. 3 vehicles was not a negotiation party. 3 vehicles was a statement. It meant Ferrara had decided that whatever he stood to lose from the exposure of the operation was less than what he stood to gain from eliminating the people who could prove it. Which meant he knew about Clara. Cole's 22-second phone call from JFK had done exactly what Adrian feared it would. Side exit, Marcus said from behind them. East wall, loading corridor. Comes out on the service alley. Covered? Adrian asked without slowing. 2 of ours are already there. Clean vehicle. No plates connected to you or the organization. How did they know which exit? Clara asked. Adrian glanced back at her. She was keeping pace without effort. Gray coat on, notebook tucked into her interior pocket, moving with the particular focused calm of someone who had rehearsed emergency exits in their mind long before the emergency arrived. They don't, Marcus said, yet. But the front and west side are already compromised. They'll work the perimeter within 5 minutes. Then we have 4, Adrian said. They covered the remaining length of the corridor in under a minute. The east loading exit opened onto a narrow service alley that smelled of cold concrete and city morning, and 2 of Adrian's men were already positioned beside a dark sedan with the engine running. Neither man asked questions. This was something Adrian had always valued about the people he'd personally selected, the understanding that questions slowed things down, and timing was everything. Adrian got Clara into the back seat first. He slid in beside her. Marcus took the front. The car moved. For approximately 90 seconds, no one said anything. The driver navigated without being told. Marcus had clearly already communicated the destination, because they were moving northeast, away from the chapel, away from the direction the 3 vehicles would have approached from, into the city's mid-morning traffic, with the deliberate ordinariness of a car that was trying very hard to look like it had no particular reason to be anywhere. Clara looked out the window. Her breathing was controlled. Her hands were in her lap. They know who I am, she said. It wasn't fear in her voice. It was the flat acknowledgement of a fact. Cole made a call from the airport, Adrian said. 22 seconds. Long enough. She was quiet for a moment. My sister in Pennsylvania. Already taken care of, Marcus said from the front, without turning. I made the call 8 minutes ago. She has 2 people with her. She doesn't know why yet, but she's safe. Clara turned to look at the back of Marcus's head. Something moved through her face, not quite surprise. Something more complicated than that. The particular expression of someone who has been operating entirely alone for so long that competent help, arriving without being asked for, registers as almost foreign. Thank you, she said quietly. Marcus nodded once. Adrian watched Clara's profile. She was staring out the window again, and he could see her processing running through the implications, mapping what Ferrara, knowing her identity, meant for the next several moves. She was doing it the way he did it, he realized. The same quality of rapid internal architecture. Building the problem into a structure that could be examined and navigated rather than simply felt. What does Ferrara actually know? He asked. Best assessment. Cole knows I worked in your archives, she said without hesitating. He knows I had access to financial records and communication logs. He doesn't know the full scope of what I built, because I was careful never to access anything from a terminal that could be tied to my name. I used legacy systems that hadn't been properly decommissioned. Systems that weren't included in the standard access logging. She paused. He knows I gave you an envelope this morning. He doesn't know what was in it. He'll assume the worst. Yes, which means he'll assume everything. She turned to look at Adrian. The question is whether Ferrara thinks eliminating me solves his problem, or whether he understands it's already too late. If he thinks it solves his problem, he keeps moving against us, she finished. If he understands it's too late, he'll try to make a deal. She paused. Which version is more dangerous? Adrian thought about it. The one where he thinks he can still fix it. Desperate men with resources are unpredictable. He looked at her. Ferrara is not a stupid man. How long before he understands it's too late? Depends on who he has inside your legal team, she said. He looked at her sharply. My legal team, I found one name, she said. I wasn't certain enough to include it in the documents. A paralegal in your firm's corporate division. She's been with the firm for 2 years, and she had a prior relationship with someone in Ferrara's Miami office. She said it carefully, watching his face. I'm sorry. I held it back because I was afraid that if I put it in the primary documents, it would alert her before you had the rest secured. Another one. Another name. Another person who had been sitting in the right rooms, hearing the right conversations, passing the right information outward. Give me the name, he said. She gave it to him. He texted it to Dante in 3 words, remove her now. Dante's response came back in 4 seconds, done. Your organization is fast, Clara observed. When it needs to be. He put the phone away. The documents on that drive your father's original case. How current is the financial trail? The networks your father built his case on have had 15 years to restructure. The architecture changes, she said. The core doesn't. Ferrara's group has been running the same fundamental operation for 20 years. The structures shift to avoid detection, but the relationships stay constant. Certain accounts, certain intermediaries, certain transaction patterns. She looked at him. What I built in the last 4 years maps directly onto what my father found 15 years ago. Same network. Same fingerprints, just grown. She paused. When you overlay the 2 datasets, it's the most comprehensive picture of Ferrara's operation that has ever existed. And you have a contact at the federal level, Adrian said. It wasn't a question. She had been building toward a federal case. She wouldn't have done that without knowing where it was going to land. Clara hesitated. Just briefly. There's an agent, she said. She was one of my father's junior colleagues 15 years ago. She stayed in the bureau. She's been waiting for something exactly like this for a long time. She paused. I've been in careful, indirect contact with her for about a year. Does she know your name? She knows enough to know I'm credible. A beat. She doesn't know I'm inside your organization. I was careful about that. Adrian absorbed this. If we go to her directly with the full package, your father's case, and everything you've built in the last 4 years, how long before it's protected by federal oversight? Before Ferrara can't touch it without making everything dramatically worse for himself. If she's been waiting for this as long as I think she has. Clara said, 48 hours. Maybe less. She looked at him. But the package has to be airtight before we hand it over. If there's a single gap he can point to. There's no gap, Adrian said. You haven't seen all of it. I have enough to know how you work, he said. There's no gap. Something shifted in her expression. The same small, controlled shift he'd seen earlier, in the storage room, when he'd used his first name. The expression of someone absorbing an unexpected thing. The car slowed. The driver pulled into a covered parking structure, a building adjacent to one of Adrian's legitimate commercial properties. A logistics company that occupied 4 floors and provided clean infrastructure for operations that needed a neutral address. We go up, Marcus said. 6th floor, secure. The 6th floor was clean and spare a working space. Not an office, with long tables and equipment that Marcus's team had clearly been setting up since before the chapel, because there were already laptops open and communication systems running when they arrived. 2 more of Adrian's people were present. Both nodded when he entered and went back to what they were doing. Adrian sat Clara at the end of the main table. He pulled a chair around, so he was facing her rather than at the other end of the table from her, a deliberate choice that she noticed. He could see it in the slight adjustment of her posture, the recalibration of how much space she was taking up. We need to move on 3 things simultaneously, he said. He wasn't giving her instructions. He was thinking out loud, in the way he thought out loud, with people whose minds he respected, which was rare enough that he noticed himself doing it. The federal contact. The documentation package. And Cole. What about Cole? She asked. Cole was inside my logistics operations for 3 years, Adrian said. He knows things that aren't in any document. He knows the operational details, the timing, the methods, the people on the ground who executed orders. He paused. If he talks, he fills in gaps that even your documentation doesn't cover. He ran, Clara said. He warned Ferrara. He's not going to cooperate. Everyone cooperates when the alternative is clearly understood, Adrian said. Clara looked at him. You're going to make him understand the alternative. I'm going to have a conversation with him, Adrian said. What he takes from that conversation is his choice. She studied him for a moment. Is this the part where I'm supposed to be troubled by your methods? Are you? She thought about it honestly, which he appreciated. 3 people are dead, she said finally. My father is dead. Cole spent 3 years helping engineer all of it. She paused. No, I'm not troubled. He nodded. I need 2 hours with him. While that's happening, I need you to prepare the complete package for the federal handoff. Everything, your documents, your father's case, the board members' written confessions from this morning. Marcus will provide whatever technical support you need. And the contact? Once the package is ready, you make the call. He looked at her. It has to be you. She knows your voice, your credibility. I'm the organized crime figure in this story. My introduction to federal law enforcement should happen through channels, not a cold call. Clara almost smiled at that. Almost. Agreed. Marcus appeared at Adrian's shoulder. Cole is ready. Adrian stood. He looked at Clara one more time. 2 hours. Don't leave this floor. I know how to stay in a room, she said. I know you do, he said. You spent 4 years doing it. He left with Marcus. Cole was in a room on the 4th floor, and he'd had time to think, which was not a comfortable thing for a man in his position. Thinking, in the wrong circumstances, has a tendency to clarify the severity of a situation that action keeps at a comfortable blur. By the time Adrian walked in, Cole had been sitting with his thoughts for long enough that his initial composure had eroded into something rawer and less managed. He was 45, lean, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and now just looked tired. He had worked in Adrian's Eastern Logistics for 3 years, and had been very good at it, the legitimate parts. Anyway, the legitimate parts had always been the cover. He looked up when Adrian entered. He didn't say anything. Adrian sat down across from him with no documents, no visual aids, no dramatic display. Just 2 men in a room, which was sometimes the most efficient format. You made a call from the airport, Adrian said. 22 seconds. Cole said nothing. In 22 seconds, you told Ferrara's Miami office that the operation was compromised, and gave them whatever identifying information you had on the person who exposed it. Adrian looked at him steadily. Which means you are personally responsible for the 3 vehicles that just attempted to intercept a civilian this morning. A woman who works in my archives department. Still nothing. Here's what I want you to understand, Adrian said. Not as a threat, as a factual orientation, because you're going to need to make a decision, and the decision should be based on accurate information. He leaned forward slightly. The complete documentary package, financial records, communication logs, transaction trails, the linked case from 15 years ago, and the written confessions of 4 of my board members from this morning is currently being assembled on this floor. Within 2 hours, it will be in federal hands. At that point, Ferrara's operation is not damaged. It is finished. Permanently, he paused. What you decide in the next 30 minutes determines whether you are inside that case, as a cooperating witness or as a subject. Cole's jaw worked slightly. You're offering me a deal. I'm explaining your options, Adrian said. The deal is between you and federal investigators. I'm just the person who can get you to that conversation alive versus the alternative. The alternative being Ferrara, Cole said flatly. You warned him, Adrian said. He knows you were caught. In Ferrara's calculus, a caught man is a liability. You understand his operation. You understand his methods. He let that sit. How long do you think he keeps liabilities around? Cole looked at the wall. He looked at the floor. He looked at his hands. I need guarantees, he said. You need to start talking, Adrian said. The guarantees come from the people who can actually give them. Talk to me first. Then I get you to those people. A long silence. Then Cole started talking. He talked for 90 minutes. He talked about the 3 years of information transfers, what he'd passed and when and to whom. He talked about the internal communication system Ferrara's people had established inside Adrian's organization, a parallel network that had existed for so long it had its own protocols. He talked about Carlyle, who had been the primary internal architect, and about 2 additional names Adrian hadn't heard before, people in operational roles who had never appeared in Clara's documents because they'd been careful enough to stay off logged systems entirely. And he talked about Robert Holt, Sandra Reyes, and Paul Destin, not with pride, not with the detachment of someone who'd made peace with it, with the specific uncomfortable quality of a man who had known and said nothing and was now being asked to hear himself say it out loud in a way that made it real. Holt had found a discrepancy in a financial record and asked questions to the wrong person. Reyes had noticed unusual shipping documentation patterns and mentioned it in a logistics meeting that the wrong ears were present for. Destin had been the unlucky one. He hadn't found anything at all, but he'd been seen talking to Holt 3 days before Holt's death, and that proximity had been enough. He was 27, Adrian said. His voice was very quiet. I know, Cole said. He didn't look away. To his credit, he didn't look away. You knew about all 3 and you said nothing. Yes. Why? Cole was quiet for a long moment. Because I told myself that if I said something, I'd be next. And then I told myself that long enough that I stopped thinking about whether it was a reason or an excuse. He paused. It was an excuse, I know that. Another pause. I've known it for 2 years. Adrian looked at him for a long time. The 2 names you gave me, he said finally. The operational people who weren't in any of the documents. They're still active inside my organization. Yes. Are they in contact with Ferrara's people right now? Since you called from the airport. Almost certainly, Cole said. They'd have been notified the moment the chapel situation broke. They'll be moving to clear their tracks. Adrian stood immediately. He had his phone out before he reached the door. He sent 3 messages in rapid succession to Marcus, to Dante, to the head of his internal security. The names. The instruction. Contain. Do not engage. Do not allow communication outside the building. He went back upstairs. Clara had been working for 90 minutes, and the table in front of her looked like the physical manifestation of 4 years of focused intelligence pages, organized into sections, cross-referenced, with a separate summary document that she'd apparently created from scratch in the time he'd been gone. 2 laptops were open, both running. Marcus's tech person was at the far end of the table, and from the look of their interaction, Clara had been directing the technical assembly with the same quiet precision she brought to everything else. She looked up when Adrian walked in. She read his face. Cole talked, she said, for 90 minutes. Did he give you anything I didn't have? 2 names. Operational. They're being contained. He sat down. He also filled in the details on Holt, Reyes, and Destin. He paused. I want those details in the package. Clara's expression shifted. I only had circumstantial links to their deaths, not the direct account. Now you have the direct account, he said. From the person who knew and said nothing. That's in the package. She nodded. Her jaw was tight. Okay. She typed something. The federal contact. I think we should call her now, before the package is complete. Give her advance notice. She'll want time to prepare the reception of this properly. If it arrives without warning, there are procedural risks that could slow down the protection it gets. Make the call, he said. She looked at him. In front of you? She needs to know who she's dealing with. Better she hears it from you first with me present than hears it later and wonders why you kept it from her. Clara considered this. Then she picked up her phone. The call connected on the 3rd ring. The woman who answered had a voice that was measured and precise, the professional steadiness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where control of tone was as important as control of facts. I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon, the woman said. Things moved faster than I planned, Clara said. She was looking at the table as she spoke, at the organized pages of 4 years of work. I'm calling because we're 48 hours from being ready to hand you something comprehensive enough to close the Ferrara operation permanently. My father's original case plus 4 years of current documentation. A pause. I'm also calling because I'm not alone, and you should know that. A silence on the other end. Who's with you? Clara looked at Adrian. He leaned forward slightly toward the phone. Adrian Valenti, he said. I'm told you've heard the name. Another silence. Longer this time. I've heard the name, the woman said carefully. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Valenti, your presence in this conversation is complicated. I understand that, he said. I'm prepared to make it less complicated. I have 4 board members' written confessions from this morning. I have a cooperative witness who can speak to 3 years of internal information transfers. And I have the intention to cooperate fully with whatever process you need, including regarding my own history, in exchange for the focused prosecution of the Ferrara network and accountability for the murders of 3 people inside my organization. He paused. I'm not offering this because I have no other options. I'm offering it because someone showed me this morning what I've been standing on top of, and I have no interest in continuing to stand on it. The silence on the other end lasted a very long time. 48 hours, the woman said finally. You don't move, you don't make any further contact with anyone outside your immediate circle, and you don't let anything happen to Clara. A pause. Are we clear? Completely, he said. Clara. The woman's voice shifted slightly, not softer but different. The shift of someone who has known a person across a distance for a long time and is now somehow closer. Your father would be. I know, Clara said quietly. Thank you. The call ended. The room was quiet for a moment. Adrian looked at Clara. She was looking at the phone in her hand, and her expression was the most unguarded he'd ever seen it, the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just set it down for the first time in 15 years. He would be proud of you, Adrian said. She looked up. Her eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with the particular emotion that lives just on the other side of a very long effort. He would want to know it was going to hold, she said. That it wasn't going to disappear this time. It won't disappear, Adrian said. He said it with the particular certainty of a man who has decided something completely. I'll make sure of it. She looked at him for a moment. You can't promise that. You don't know what the next 48 hours look like. No, he agreed. But I know that I'm not walking away from it. And I know that I have resources, and I have motivation, and I have the most comprehensive intelligence I've ever seen assembled by a single person. He looked at her steadily, and I know that 3 people who deserved better are not going to be forgotten, footnotes in someone else's story. Not while I can do something about it. Clara held his gaze. Something in her was very still, the stillness of someone deciding whether to believe something they've wanted to believe for a long time. Then Marcus appeared in the doorway. His expression had the quality Adrian recognized as significant news arriving with poor timing. Ferrara, Marcus said. He's made contact. Not through his usual channels. A pause. He's asking for a direct conversation. With you. He looked at Adrian. He says he has something you want more than what you think you currently have. The room shifted. Adrian and Clara looked at each other at the same moment. He's bluffing, she said. Probably, Adrian agreed. Or he has something that wasn't in any of the documents, she said. Her voice was careful. Something I didn't find. The possibility sat between them like a held breath. What could he have? Adrian asked. That isn't already accounted for. Clara was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes moved slightly, the internal movement of someone running through possibilities, cross-referencing, testing scenarios against what she knew. And then something changed in her face. Something subtle and significant that Adrian caught immediately. What? He said. My father's investigation, she said slowly. He had a source. Someone inside Ferrara's organization who was feeding him information in the final months before. She stopped. I never found the source's identity. My father's files never named them directly. It was the one gap I couldn't close. She looked at Adrian. If Ferrara knows who that source was, and what they told my father, he knows what we don't know, Adrian said. He knows what my father died knowing, she said. And we don't. The weight of that landed in the room with everything else. Adrian looked at Marcus. Tell him I'll talk, he said. An hour, my terms on location. He looked back at Clara. Don't touch the package. Not until I know what he has. Adrian. His name in her voice still slightly new, still slightly careful. He stopped. Be careful what you agree to. Ferrara doesn't offer conversations. He offers traps. He looked at her. I know, he said. But this is one conversation I can't afford to walk away from without having. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he went to find out what Ferrara knew that had been worth killing her father to protect. The meeting with Ferrara happened in a restaurant that no longer had any customers in it. That was Ferrara's term, a neutral space. No weapons visible, no more than 2 people each. Adrian had agreed to the location and the terms, and had spent the 40-minute drive running through every possible version of what Ferrara's leverage could be, testing each scenario against what Clara had told him about her father's source, measuring the gap between what the documents contained and what remained unknown. He arrived first deliberately. He wanted to be seated when Ferrara walked in, wanted the psychological positioning of a man who was not waiting but simply present, which was a different thing entirely. Ferrara arrived 4 minutes later. He was older than his photographs suggested, mid-60s, compact, with the unhurried movement of a man who had spent decades being the most dangerous person in most rooms and had stopped feeling the need to demonstrate it. He sat across from Adrian, without ceremony, and looked at him with the direct, appraising attention of someone taking genuine measure. "You ended your wedding this morning," Ferrara said. His voice was lower than Adrian expected. Conversational. "I heard it didn't go particularly smoothly. It went exactly the way it needed to," Adrian said. "The Belmont girl." Ferrara shook his head slightly. "She overreached. She always overreached. I told her father 2 years ago that the plan had too many moving parts." He paused. He didn't want to hear it. "You were advising Gerald Belmont." "I was advising everyone," Ferrara said simply. "That's been my role for 20 years. People come to me with problems. I help them think through solutions." He looked at Adrian. "You came from a good family. Your father was a man I respected. The situation with his death was not something I sanctioned." The words landed with careful precision. Adrian kept his face still. "But you knew about it." After the fact, Ferrara said, "And I want to be clear, the people who made that decision did so without my authorization. They've been dealt with. That's not something I'm proud of, but it's something that was corrected." "Corrected," Adrian repeated. The word tasted wrong. "My father is still dead." "Yes," Ferrara said. No deflection. No performance of regret. Just the flat acknowledgement of a man who had lived long enough in his world to have stopped pretending that acknowledgement was the same as accountability. "He is, and nothing I say today changes that." He paused. "But I didn't ask for this meeting to discuss your father." "Then what did you ask for it to discuss?" Ferrara reached into his jacket slowly, with the deliberate telegraphing of a man who wants it clear he's not reaching for anything dangerous. He placed a photograph on the table between them. Adrian looked at it. The photograph was old, the kind of slightly faded quality that put it at least 15 years back. It showed 2 men in conversation, outside what appeared to be a federal building. One of the men was Thomas Whitmore, Clara's father, recognizable from the file Marcus had compiled. The other man was someone Adrian didn't recognize immediately. And then he did. The recognition arrived with a particular cold clarity of something that shouldn't be true presenting itself as undeniably true. The kind of moment where the mind runs a quick internal verification, checks the face against memory, checks the context against everything it knows, and comes back with a confirmation that feels like a door closing somewhere. "Who is he?" Adrian asked. His voice was level. "His name at the time was David Crane," Ferrara said. "He was a federal agent. One of Thomas Whitmore's closest colleagues on the investigation." He paused. "He was also the person who informed my network about the timeline of the investigation, about when the case would go to the grand jury, about the specific vulnerability in Whitmore's route that particular morning." He looked at Adrian across the table. "He is the reason Thomas Whitmore didn't make it to court." Adrian stared at the photograph. "He's still in the bureau," Ferrara said quietly. "Promoted 3 times since then. He's currently a senior supervisory agent." Another pause. "He's also the person Clara Whitmore has been in indirect contact with for the past year, believing him to be an ally." The room went very cold. Not the temperature of it. Something else. The internal cold of a situation revealing a dimension that changes the geometry of everything. "She doesn't know," Adrian said. "She has no reason to know," Ferrara said. "She was 19 when her father died. She knew her father's colleagues existed, but she never had specific names, specific faces. She's been reaching toward someone she believed was carrying her father's legacy forward." He paused. "She's been reaching toward the man who ended it." Adrian picked up the photograph. He turned it over. On the back, in handwriting that meant nothing to him, was a date and a case reference number that meant everything, the specific case number from Thomas Whitmore's federal investigation, written in what appeared to be Whitmore's own hand, with a note beside it in different handwriting. A different pen. A different person. The note was 3 words. "He's been compromised." Thomas Whitmore had known. In the final days of his investigation, He had figured out that someone close to him was feeding information outward. He had written it down. He had been killed before he could act on it, and that note had been in Ferrara's possession for 15 years. "Why are you giving me this?" Adrian asked. His voice was very quiet. "Because the alternative is that Clara Whitmore hands a comprehensive federal package to the man who killed her father," Ferrara said. "And whatever disagreements you and I have about the current situation, and we have significant ones, I have interest in that happen." He looked at Adrian steadily. "And because what comes next, if this goes where I think it's going, is going to be cleaner for everyone if the right people are identified correctly from the beginning." "You're trying to control the narrative," Adrian said. "You're trying to shape what gets handed to federal investigators and who the primary target is." "I'm trying to ensure," Ferrara said carefully, "that a man who has been protected by his badge for 15 years is not in a position to receive and then bury the most comprehensive case ever built against my organization." He paused. "That is also in your interest. And in Clara's." Adrian looked at him for a long moment. "If I verify this independently, and it holds," he said, "what do you want in exchange?" "A conversation," Ferrara said, "a real one, about what a different kind of arrangement looks like going forward." He paused. "I'm 66 years old. I've been doing this for 40 years. I have no interest in spending the rest of my life fighting a war I don't need to fight." He looked at Adrian directly. "Your father believed your organization could become something different. So did mine, once. We made different choices." He stood slowly. "Maybe the next generation makes better ones." He left the photograph on the table. He left without another word. Adrian was back on the 6th floor in 22 minutes. Clara was still at the table when he came through the door, still working, her focus so complete that she didn't hear him immediately. Marcus was at the far end of the room. When Marcus saw Adrian's face, he stood. "Everyone out," Adrian said. His voice was controlled. "Give us the room." Marcus moved the two tech people out without questions. The door closed. Clara had looked up by then. She was reading his expression the way she always read things, quickly, precisely, with a quality of attention that missed very little. "You found something," she said. He sat down across from her. Not at the end of the table. Directly across, the way he'd been doing all day, close enough that there was no distance that could be misread as performance or management. He placed the photograph between them. She looked at it. He watched her face as she processed the image, the initial recognition of her father, the slight forward lean that happened unconsciously when something matters, and then the long stillness as her eyes moved to the second man, as her mind began the same process his had done, the cross-referencing, the verification, the slow arrival at a conclusion that shouldn't be possible but was. "That's..." She stopped. "Yes," he said. "That's..." She stopped again. Her hand came up and touched the edge of the photograph, not touching the image itself, just the white border around it. The gesture of someone who cannot quite bring themselves to make contact with something. "His name was David Crane at the time," Adrian said. "He's been promoted 3 times. He's currently a senior supervisory agent," Clara said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "He told me he was one of my father's most trusted colleagues. He told me my father talked about me." She stopped. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were very bright. "He told me my father was proud of me." "Clara, he used that," she said. Her voice didn't break. It sharpened. It went from grief directly through grief and came out the other side as something focused and hard and absolutely controlled. "He used my father's name to manage what I was building, to position himself as the person who would receive it." She looked up from the photograph. "He would have buried it. Everything. The complete package. 4 years of my work and my father's 15-year case. He would have received it, and it would have disappeared, and no one would have known why." "Yes," Adrian said. "That's what would have happened." She looked at him. "How do you know this is real?" "Ferrara." "I know Ferrara is trying to manage the outcome," Adrian said. "I know he has his own reasons for wanting this specific agent neutralized. I know this is not pure altruism." He held her gaze. "But the photograph is real. The case reference on the back is real. It matches your father's file exactly. And the note on the back, in your father's handwriting." He turned the photograph over. She read the 3 words. He watched something move through her that was enormous and private, and that he didn't try to name or interpret. She sat with it for a moment, the particular weight of a daughter discovering that her father had known, in his final days, that something was wrong, that he'd been careful enough to write it down, that he'd died before it could save him. He knew, she said quietly. Yes, he knew, and he didn't. She stopped. He was protecting the case. If he'd acted on it directly, the case would have collapsed. He was waiting to get it to the grand jury, where it would be protected by the proceedings. She paused. He was so close. He was 8 days away, Adrian said. Clara nodded slowly. She set the photograph down. She looked at the table, at the organized pages of 4 years of work, with an expression that Adrian thought he understood, though he knew he could only understand it partially. The expression of someone realizing that the foundation they built on was both more solid and more painful than they knew. The federal contact, she said. Her voice was steadier now, the controlled focus coming back. The woman I've been calling. She's not him. No, she's separate. I need to verify that independently. Before we hand anything to anyone, I need to run every name through what I have and make sure there are no other compromises I missed. How long? 2 hours. Maybe 3. She looked at him. And then we need a different channel. Not the one I was planning to use. A completely different entry point into federal jurisdiction. She paused. Something that bypasses his reach entirely. I have one, Adrian said. She looked at him. You have a federal contact. I have a federal contact who has been wanting to speak with me for approximately 3 years about things that are now directly relevant to this conversation, he said. I've been avoiding that conversation for 3 years. He paused. I'm done avoiding it. Clara stared at him. You're going to turn yourself in. I'm going to have an honest conversation, he said, with documentation and cooperation, and the most comprehensive case against the Ferrara network that has ever existed. He looked at her. And I'm going to name the agent in that photograph as a corrupted federal official, and I'm going to hand them the evidence that proves it. He paused. That's not turning myself in. That's building something. You could go to prison, she said, directly, without softening it. Because she was Clara, and she didn't soften things that needed to be said clearly. Parts of my history could result in legal consequences, he said. I have lawyers who are working on what those look like. But yes, there are things I've done that have costs. I've known that for a long time. He looked at her. The question is whether knowing the cost is a reason to keep running from it or a reason to finally stop. She was quiet for a moment. Your father's organization, she said slowly. The thing he built and believed in. The thing Carlyle and the others were using as a cover for everything they were doing underneath it. Yes, you could still build that, she said. The legitimate version. The real version. Not as a cover for something else, just as what it is. She looked at him carefully, as if testing whether she was overstepping. The legitimate operations you've developed in the last 4 years. The people you've protected. The businesses that are actually clean. She paused. That's real. That already exists. It exists on a bad foundation, he said. Then we pull the foundation out and build a new one, she said. Together if you want. She paused. The word together had landed in the room, and she let it sit there without taking it back. I'm good at finding what's been hidden. I'm good at reconstructing what was destroyed. I can help you understand what you have and what it's actually standing on. She paused again. If you want that. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. The woman across from him had spent 4 years being invisible in his organization, had survived by being overlooked, had built the most comprehensive piece of intelligence work he'd ever encountered entirely alone, had walked into the most dangerous moment of his life with an envelope and steady hands, and had just offered to help him rebuild everything she'd helped tear down. Not for power, not for recognition, not for anything he could clearly name as self-interest. Why, he asked. The same question he'd asked her outside the chapel, the one that had no satisfying answer the first time. She didn't hesitate this time. Because 3 people who were trying to do the right thing are dead, she said. And my father is dead. And someone has to make sure that all of it meant something. She looked at him steadily. And because I think you're the only person in a position to actually do that. And I think you know it. She paused one more time. And because I've been watching you for 4 years, Adrian. And I know what you're capable of when you stop letting other people define what that means. The room was very quiet. Outside, the city continued its indifferent momentum. Somewhere in this building, 4 board members had finished filling legal pads. Cole was preparing to repeat everything he'd said to the right federal ears. The documentation package was 90% complete. Two people in Adrian's organization were being contained after trying to reach Ferrara. A corrupted federal agent named David Crane was still at his desk, unaware that the woman he'd been carefully managing for a year had just learned his real name. Everything was in motion. Everything was already too far along to stop. But in this room, in this moment, before all of it reached its conclusion, two people sat across from each other and made a decision. "All right," Adrian said. Together. What followed was not a montage of triumphs. It was not clean or simple or quickly resolved. The next 6 months were the hardest Adrian Valenti had ever lived through, and he had lived through years that other men wouldn't have survived. The federal cooperation opened doors and closed others simultaneously. There were lawyers and depositions and negotiations that lasted entire days. There were decisions about which parts of his history could be defended and which parts required accountability, and the accounting was sometimes brutal. He lost 2 legitimate businesses in the restructuring companies he'd built himself, that employed people he'd known for years, that had to be surrendered as part of the process of separating clean from compromised. He let them go without pretending it didn't cost him. The case against Ferrara's network was filed in federal court 8 days after the wedding that never happened. The documentation was described by the prosecutors, handling it as the most complete civilian intelligence package they had ever received. It named 47 individuals across 3 states. It included financial evidence going back 15 years, linked directly to Thomas Whitmore's original investigation through the records on the USB drive that Clara had carried for 12 years in her coat pocket. David Crane, senior supervisory federal agent, was arrested at his desk on a Thursday morning. He did not cooperate. He spent 11 months insisting on his innocence, and then, when the evidence became impossible to argue against, stopped insisting anything. He was convicted on 4 counts, including accessory after the fact in the death of Thomas Whitmore. The sentencing was on a day Clara did not attend. She said she didn't need to be in that room for it to be real. Adrian believed her. Carlisle pled guilty to 11 charges and received a sentence that his lawyers considered lenient and that Adrian considered appropriate, given the distinction between knowing and acting that he had decided, early on, to actually hold to. Morano cooperated fully and received credit for it. Hendricks cooperated fully and received slightly less credit, because $14 million was still $14 million. DeLuca's situation was handled with the particular legal precision that his circumstances coerced rather than willing made possible. Cole's cooperation resulted in a reduced sentence and relocation. Whatever Adrian thought about that, he kept to himself. Victoria and her father entered into a separate federal proceeding that had been referred to a different jurisdiction. Adrian kept his word about not making it worse than it needed to be. The 3 people who died were named in the charges. Their names were stated in open court, on the record, in a proceeding that generated significant news coverage. Robert Holt, Sandra Reyes, Paul Destin, 27, 29, and 41 years old respectively. Their families were notified directly, personally, by a lawyer, Adrian, hired specifically for that purpose. Sandra Reyes's family received something additional, a letter, written by hand, not by the lawyer. It described Sandra's work, what she had noticed, what she had done with what she noticed, how close she had come to the truth before someone stopped her. The letter said she had been brave and careful and had deserved to be protected by the organization she was trying to protect. It did not make excuses. It said only that her daughter had mattered, that she had not been a footnote, that the people responsible were being held accountable because she had not stayed quiet. The letter was signed by Adrian Valenti. He wrote it at 2 a.m, at a desk in an office that was beginning to look like the kind of office his father had imagined when he imagined what the organization could become. He wrote it 3 times before he was satisfied that it said what needed to be said without saying anything that wasn't true. Clara was in the building when he finished it. She was often in the building, in those months working, reorganizing, building the internal compliance and documentation systems that were one of the conditions of the Federal Cooperation Agreement, and that she had offered to design before anyone asked her to. She had a desk now that was not in archives. She had a title that reflected what she actually did rather than what she'd been pretending to do for 4 years. She had a salary that reflected it too, though she'd argued about that initially, with the particular stubbornness of someone who had spent years not asking for things. He'd won that argument. One of the few he won cleanly. She was in the hallway when he came out of the office at 2:30 in the morning, and she had a coffee in her hand that she held out to him before he'd said a word. "You're still here," he said. "The compliance documentation for the Eastern Logistics restructuring is due to the Federal Oversight Office by Friday," she said. "I'm finishing it. It's 2:30 in the morning. I'm aware." She looked at him. "You finished the letter. How did you know I was writing a letter?" "Because you've been in that office for 4 hours, and when you have something to figure out that isn't a strategy, you write it down." She said it matter-of-factly, without calculation. "You write things you don't say. I've noticed." He took the coffee. "You notice everything." "Most things," she said. "I missed David Crane for a year. I'm not perfect. None of us are." He looked at her for a moment. "The letter is for Sandra Reyes's family. Her mother, specifically. I looked her up." He paused. "She's 63. She lives in Queens. She goes to church on Sundays." He stopped. She never knew the full story of what her daughter found. Clara was quiet for a moment. "She'll know now." "Yes." He looked at the letter in his hand. "It felt necessary." "It is necessary," Clara said. "Not agreeable. Certain." The way she said things she'd already thought through. "It's one of the most necessary things you'll do in all of this." She paused. "Do you want me to read it? Before it goes out?" He handed it to her. She read it in the hallway at 2:30 in the morning, with the quiet concentration she brought to everything, and when she finished, she handed it back without comment. She didn't say it was good. She didn't say it was enough. She said, "Send it." He sent it. 6 months after the wedding that didn't happen, Adrian went back to the chapel. He went alone, on a Wednesday morning when the building was quiet, and Father Callum was the only other person there, doing something administrative in the back office. The priest looked up when Adrian came in, and after a moment's assessment, the kind of assessment that takes the full measure of a person rather than just the surface, he nodded once and went back to what he was doing. Adrian sat in one of the pews. Not the front one. Not where power and performance would have put him. The middle, where ordinary people sat when they came to think. He sat there for a while. He thought about his father, about the man who had built something and believed in it, and tried to protect his son by staying quiet when he should have been loud, and who had died for the attempt. He thought about what it would mean to rebuild on the actual foundation his father had wanted, not the one that had been corrupted underneath it, but the real intention, the thing his father had described in board meetings and private conversations and one particular dinner in a restaurant in the village, where a young woman with an extraordinary memory had been leaving the room and had stayed. He thought about the 3 people whose names were now on a federal record, spoken out loud in open court, permanent. He thought about a 19-year-old girl identifying her father in a Virginia hospital and then going home to figure out how to carry something that shouldn't have been hers to carry. He thought about what it meant to be seen, really seen not as a useful thing, not as a powerful thing, but as a person with a specific history and specific choices still ahead. The door of the chapel opened behind him. He didn't turn. He knew the sound of those footsteps. He'd been learning them for 6 months, and he was better at attention than he used to be. Clara sat down beside him. Not in the next pew, right beside him, with the matter-of-fact closeness of someone who has stopped calculating whether proximity is appropriate. "Father Callum called you," Adrian said. "He calls me when he's concerned about you," she said. "He's been doing it for 3 months, I assume you know." "I know," Adrian said. "I didn't tell him to stop." She looked at him. "How are you?" It was the same question she'd asked him on the first morning, in the storage room, after the wedding was over. The same unguarded directness. The same absence of calculation about what the answer might cost her. "Better than I was," he said. "Not as good as I want to be." He paused. "Honest answer." "That's the only answer I want," she said. They sat for a moment in the quiet of the chapel. The same chapel where the Italian roses had been arranged, and the French candles had burned, and 400 people had waited for a wedding that was never going to be what it appeared to be. It looked different now, or he looked at it differently. He couldn't entirely tell which. "I've been thinking about my father," he said. "I know," she said. "He was wrong to stay quiet," Adrian said. "I understand why he did it. I understand the love behind it." But the silence didn't protect me, it just delayed the damage and made it worse. He paused. The people I most respect now are the ones who said something when it was dangerous to say it. He looked at her. Like a woman I know who stood outside a chapel for 40 minutes with an envelope. Clara looked at the altar. Your father was trying to protect you the only way he knew how, she said. That's not the same as being wrong about everything. A pause. He just needed someone to show him a different option. She paused again, the same way you did. Adrian looked at her profile. The same steady, quiet face. The same person who had been doing the right thing in invisible rooms for 4 years and had never needed an audience for it. I never thanked you properly, he said. For what you did. Not just the evidence. All of it. You've been thanking me, she said. For 6 months. In every decision you've made. She turned to look at him. That's what thanks actually looks like. Not the word. The thing after. He held her gaze. I want to ask you something, he said. And I want you to answer honestly, not helpfully. There's a difference. I know the difference, she said. Do you regret it, he asked. Coming to me. Handing me the envelope. All of it. Knowing what the last 6 months have been. He paused. Knowing what the next 6 months will be. Clara was quiet for a moment. Not a hesitating quiet, a thinking quiet. The kind she gave to things that deserved to be thought about. No, she said. I regret that it was necessary. I regret that 3 people had to die before someone could stop it. I regret that my father died 15 years ago, and the man responsible spent 15 years with a badge and a promotion. Her voice was even and clear. But do I regret walking up to you that morning? No. She paused. Not even a little. He was quiet. Not even a little, he said. You were worth the risk, she said simply. Not romantically. Not as a declaration. As a statement of assessment from a woman who had spent 4 years conducting the most careful due diligence of her life. I made that determination 2 years before I walked up to you. I was right. Adrian looked at the altar where a woman in a white dress had stood 6 months ago with a plan designed to end his life. He thought about what had stood between him and that ending. A gray coat. A sealed envelope. 40 minutes of standing outside in the cold. A woman no one ever thought to watch. Come back to the office, Clara said. She stood. She held out her hand, not dramatically, just practically, the way she did most things. The Eastern Logistics Compliance documentation isn't going to finish itself, and I need your sign-off on 2 sections before Friday. He looked at her hand. He took it. And Adrian Valenti stood up from the pew in the chapel where his old life had ended on a Tuesday morning, and walked out into the one that had begun, because a quiet woman with an extraordinary mind had decided, after 4 years of watching from the corners, that someone had to finally say something. She had been right. He had been worth the risk. And from that morning forward, from the envelope, from the 40 minutes, from the question that changed everything, neither of them would ever again mistake invisibility for weakness, or silence for safety, or the most dangerous kind of courage for anything less than exactly what it was. The decision to walk toward the truth when every reasonable instinct said to walk away. That decision had cost them both, and it had given them everything worth keeping.